All right. So before we dive deep into the questions, I just want to ask, how are you doing during COVID-19? How has it affected your life so far?
Well, I think the biggest impact is I have a daughter who is 21, and God willing will turn 22 in July, and she lives and works in Montreal. And of course, unfortunately, Montreal is one of the centers of the pandemic
Mhm.
in Canada. And so I'm unable to go there. And I've had the habit of going every month to see her.
Yeah.
So the last time I saw her was in March. And wasn't able to get down last month, can't get down this month, and may not be able to get down next month.
Yeah.
So I thank God that we have other ways of communicating, of course. But that's the thing that's been most hurtful, I guess, to say. Otherwise, I'm a tenured academic professor of English, University of Toronto.
Yeah.
So I still have income coming in. I praise God for that too, and I'm able to see my companion, who lives on the other side of town from me.
Mhm.
But that gives us both a reason to get up and get out
Yeah.
and drive across Toronto
Yeah.
in one direction or the other.
Yeah.
Spend time with each other, and so that's been okay. I'm supposed to have more time to read. I'm
Yeah.
supposed time to read, but I haven't had much more time to read.
Yeah.
Partly because I still have schoolwork,
Mm.
things I need to do for the university, and even though it doesn't take up that much time, it takes up enough.
Yeah.
And then I find it hard to really focus on my on reading,
Mm.
but I am able to get some writing done.
Yeah.
And that's good. Although now I have to do it mainly here at home,
Yeah.
and I'm someone who has, for most of my writing career, I've always been traveling. I always
Mm.
go other places, like either in Canada or someplace else in the world,
Yeah.
and I've appreciated that. But now I'm getting to know my home.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so for the next question, I want to ask, have you found any inspiration during this time, during COVID? And if you have you been able to produce any new literary works?
Well, Stefan, I got to tell you, your questions are excellent. They are really, really good. They're very thoughtful. I commend you on them. And they've had me thinking quite a bit about the last 8 weeks. And there is so much here
Mm.
for us all to be interested in, concerned about, worried about, dream about, have nightmares about, everything.
Yeah.
Because um, what really separates human beings from animals is something called culture and something called civilization. That's it. And of course, the gifts of language and speech and so on. This is what really separates us from other animals. And that's it. But what the virus has done is shown us, proven to us, all of us, just how fragile these human inventions are.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Specifically culture and civilization,
Mhm.
how absolutely fragile they are.
Yeah.
Even the most complex economic systems ever devised, the ones that we are living with right now,
Yeah.
and all the electronics and all the smart this and smart that, we find ourselves struggling to stay on top of the changes that this life-threatening virus is imposing on us. No matter what our political beliefs, religious beliefs, doesn't matter. They're all there. And at the same time that we in the Western side of the world are struggling with our economies and struggling to maintain our healthcare services and struggling to provide comfort for those who are ill, care for those who are ill, to somehow bury loved ones with a degree of dignity and love. All that is going on. Nature is acting like nothing is happening.
Yeah.
The grass is growing, the flowers are blooming, the blossoms are on the trees.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful time of the year. And so all of nature except humanity is able to take it easy. In fact, one of the great benefits of this crisis, in fact, maybe the only great benefit of this crisis, is that it's allowing animals to reappear who have been unseen for years, if not decades. There's been a chance for the world to clean itself. The fact that the canals in Venice are now more or less transparent, as opposed to being the dark green color they have been for ages. And the fact that fish have reappeared in places where we haven't seen them before, birds coming back places we haven't seen before. So that's one of the upsides of this whole thing. And also the fact that we want to reach out to our loved ones more. We want to be more in contact as much as possible, even if it can't be physical, with friends, and to maintain a sense of community. My church, New Horizons Baptist Church in Halifax, sends me the services online. So that's great, and wonderful to have that connection. Well, I'm taking a long time to answer your very, very good question.
No, it's fine. Take your time. I like how you're giving background and alluding to it. So keep going.
Yeah, it's. I mean, for one thing, we all have a lot more time to think.
For sure.
Without the daily distractions, the usual daily distractions, there is a lot more time that's available for contemplation of one sort or another. And so I started to say that everything's been implicated by this crisis. And what I mean by that, and I started off talking about civilization and culture. Look, well, however we have thought about running our economies before this crisis, I have to say that everybody has had a huge wake-up call if we want to wake up. We've got a huge wake-up call going on right now, which is, number one, you need big government. You need socialism. You need to have a big government that can pull together all the resources necessary in order to take care of the people, to take care of the population. Even big business is now lining up and saying, "Oh, we need to get a little bit of the people's money too." And I think that's good. I think we should all be reminded that every single tax dollar is ours. It's yours and it's mine. It doesn't belong to anybody else but the people.
Exactly.
And so whenever people complain about social spending, I don't want to hear it. If somebody comes after this crisis has subsided and says, "Oh, the government shouldn't be spending money on this, shouldn't be spending money on that," I want to tell them, what's the government for if it's not to spend money on us?
Exactly.
It's money.
Exactly.
Why you have a government? Why bother having a government if you can't tell them to spend the money on us? Collect the money from everybody and spend it on us. What's the point? Otherwise, I'm having it. And I think this crisis proves that you need to have that. Just in a sensible ordering of society, you got to have a government that's big enough, that's got enough income coming in to support the people in times of emergency. You know, I need to go back to the Old Testament, Hebrew scripture, and the whole idea of the 7 years of plenty followed by the 7 years of drought, the 7 years of famine. And what this crisis reminds us is that you always got to have some resources saved up for times like now, for times just like this. And they always happen. So that's one thing. Economically, we got to rethink things. We need to have a green base for the economy. That's absolutely clear now. If it wasn't clear before, it should be crystal clear now that we can't talk about real prosperity or sustainable prosperity unless everything has a green base now. We got to have it. And I think that's also very clear to everyone. In terms of philosophy, I've mentioned socialism, but I also need to emphasize democracy. I need to emphasize civil liberties, because here we are in Canada having been asked voluntarily to surrender our rights to free association, surrender our rights to gather in public places, maybe to protest. You notice, like, one of the problems with this pandemic, at least in democracies, is that since we've all been told to stay home, social distance, don't gather in crowds, and so on, for good medical reasons, one of the negative byproducts of that is that it's not as easy for us to hold governments to account. I think we should all be a little bit nostalgic for the good old days when masses of people could march in the streets and demand change from the government.
Yeah.
And now we gotta sign online petitions. It's not the same thing.
It's not the same. Exactly.
So we need to have reinvigorated those democratic ideals and civil libertarian ideals. And to be able to be free to travel, free to associate, and even free to speak. And without feeling that we're going to have the police knocking on our doors, giving us a fine because we sat too close to a perfect stranger on a park bench. I know I'm exaggerating a little bit, and I do not want to play down the dangers of large social gatherings, because those dangers are real. Those risks are there.
Yeah.
But I also think that we need to have more of a discussion about why it is that governments have felt that it can be so easy to suspend culture, suspend civil liberties to a certain extent, without necessarily calling in a state of emergency. But the effect is the same. And I think that this virus, not only has it proved how fragile civilization infrastructure is, it's also showing us how fragile our hard-won rights are in the face of emergencies of any sort. And I need to speak as a Black person. I got to speak as a racialized Black person. You know, the biggest struggle that Black people have had in North America and all the places, the Caribbean, South America, where there was the African slave trade, Europe itself too. In all these places, the number one battle that our ancestors had to fight was for the freedom, not just to be free of chains and free of masses' whips and so on, but free to move. Free to move. Yeah. Mobility rights. Exactly. That's a fundamental Black right, mobility rights. And that's what's always when we are stopped and questioned by police now, it's an assault on our mobility. The most precious freedom Black people have is the ability to move, the ability to go from here to there without having to explain ourselves. That includes being able to get in our car and drive somewhere without being stopped. See, the extension of, I know I'm going off topic here.
No, continue, please continue, please continue. You're dropping gems, sir.
You know, the extension of the repeal of abolition, the repeal of anti-slavery, which has been undertaken by police forces all over North America especially. The extension of that is the necessity of stopping and carding and checking and trying to determine, why is this person of African heritage, Negro African heritage, why is this person someplace where we don't believe he, she, or they should be? That's the fundamental assault on our existence, is this notion that we need to be policed in our movements, that we can't be in that neighborhood because we are the wrong complexion. We can't be driving that kind of car because, again, we're the wrong complexion, because our racialization says that we're supposed to be subjugated and subject to white people's oversight. So one of the powers that this emergency has granted essentially mainstream white authority is the ability to once again try to impose movement controls. And now that's true, it's for everybody, not just for Black people, but it may have an adverse effect on Black people, given the racism that has always lied behind these struggles to try to demarcate where we can go. And I know that I might sound extreme when I say this, and I hope I don't, but I think, again, I'll just say this, that we should be, as Black citizens, particularly guarded in terms of our willingness to surrender especially our mobility rights.
Yeah.
Because that was the most fundamental freedom that we won with the extinction of slavery, to be able to move from the south to the north, be able to move from that racist town to a less racist town, to go from that neighborhood to another neighborhood, to basically escape segregation. So philosophically speaking, the pandemic can give excuse to governments to reimpose degrees of segregation on their population. So that's a long way of saying, once again, that we need to be, and I take this from this crisis, that we also need to be thinking philosophically and politically about how dear and darling and important our civil liberties are, and to insist upon them, within reason, because we got to follow the public health guidelines. But I also think that the public health guidelines should be followed with a degree of, how can I put it, courteous reluctance, or charitable reluctance, in the sense that we will do what is necessary to maintain the public health and public good. But we should do so with a degree of protest, to say that when this is all over, we want our mobility rights reasserted powerfully, and with an acknowledgement of the sacrifice that was made. And I say this particularly for Black peoples, that no one should think that we thought it was okay that our mobility rights were challenged, because they've always been challenged. Yeah. And so this just makes it potentially worse. And so there has to be some kind of fight back against that. So these are the things I've been thinking about that this crisis has brought home to me. And yeah, so that's a long answer to your question.
Yes, but it's a good answer. I like that answer. So it's been proven that COVID-19 has infected majority of African Americans within America as well as around the world, and it's actually proven that African Americans are more at risk of dying from COVID-19. So why do you think that is?
What the virus has also exposed for everyone all around the world is the price of poverty, and the price of segregation, and the price of oppression. So for Indigenous communities in Canada as well as we can think of populations like that of Brazil or India or Africa, where there are a lot of people struggling to make ends meet, who have no choice but to go out and work and go out into the public in order to earn enough money to keep food on the table and keep their children clothed and in school and so on. So in other words, the price of class stratification is really what we're talking about here. And along with that, racialization and marginalization of various groups. All those peoples who are marginalized as being less than, as having less income than, as being less empowered than, as being less valid than, are also all those peoples who are far more likely to be in situations where they might come into contact with people who are living with this illness, suffering this illness, but who are too poor, too marginalized to be able to seek any treatment, and who feel that it's better to run the risk of dying or passing on the disease to others than it would be to forego a day's labor when people have to live hand to mouth day by day. And so for Black peoples in Africa, as well as in the overdeveloped world and in the Caribbean, many of us do fall into those categories where we are the service workers, we are the cleaners, we are nurses, sometimes doctors, but we're also going to be many times the caregivers and caretakers and the frontline workers in a lot of these societies in terms of what we have to do to make a living. And even though now there's a lot of celebration of particularly janitors and cleaners and maids and so on, as being, oh, you're the frontline workers, you're keeping everything clean and spick and span, like you always did, by the way, But
Yeah.
now we really value it because it's important. But despite all that celebration, there has not been, until very recently, an attitude of, well, you need to have a few more dollars in your pocket, given the important work that you're doing,
Yeah.
sanitation in general, and even to have the personal protective equipment that might be necessary.
Mhm.
So essentially, poor people, working class people, marginalized people, racialized people are all going to be those who are going to run the risk because of their need to make a livelihood on a daily basis,
Yeah.
and because of the service positions that they often occupy, are going to be far more likely to run into possibilities of transmission in the community, and worse, than carry that home to their families.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, and then also there's also just the brute fact that you've got to be able to get to medical treatment. If you don't have a car, if you don't have a means of transportation, if you don't have public transportation, then it's going to be, and this will be particularly true in developing nations, it's going to be far more difficult for you to get access to medical treatment that you might need. So all of these factors, which boil down ultimately to, as I say, economic stratification, have the impact of making the have-nots suffer far more than the haves. And one more point about all this, it goes back to the discussion of civil liberties. There has arisen a discussion right now that what we might need to bring about are something called immunity passports. And these passports will be granted to those persons who have suffered through a bout of infection with COVID-19 and therefore are presumed to have a degree of immunity, although no one can say for how long that might last, whether it's weeks or months or years or for the rest of your life. Nobody knows.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, so I see the move towards this kind of thinking that only people with immunity passports could be free to travel or free to work, as being, if it ever did come to pass, that would be a colossal assault on civil liberties as well as human rights, and it could easily become racialized, and it would create a new class of elites versus everybody else. And that the only way you could join that new elite club is if you got sick with COVID-19 and survived, which is actually crazy, because what that would do is encourage people who want to be who want to have their immunity passport to deliberately contract the disease and pray to survive so they can get their immunity passport and then go back to work. So I think that's an idea that is absolutely outrageous. And I hope that we in Canada never allow such a system to come into place. It's bad enough that we're moving towards contact tracing, which is also a violation and potential violation of civil liberties, again, mobility rights and so on. So I view these developments with great trepidation, but again, answering your question, the fact that that Black people bear the brunt of fatalities in the United States and perhaps also in Canada, and Indigenous people in Canada as well, may bear the brunt of fatalities outside of long-term care residences, is simply a reflection of the long-standing classist stratification and racialized stratification of our society, of our societies in the US and in Canada. And so that's also being powerfully exposed by this virus.
As a writer, if you were to capture this moment through a novel, would you capture it through the lens of the systematic inequalities that exist, that show the racial disparity between Black Americans and Black Canadians, and how we are treated unequally within the healthcare system?
Again, that's a doozy of a question. Wow. Man. Whatever, if I were going to write a novel based on this situation right now, it would definitely be like a Margaret Atwood dystopic view. It would definitely be a sober novel, very sobering, and again, a dystopia would be, but the dystopia would be what we have, because what we have is a dystopia. which is exactly the job of science fiction and sometimes fantasy, to point out that the realities that we already have are in fact dystopic. I got to say quickly, I'm glad we're in Canada. I'm glad things are not too bad here. I'm glad that we seem to be muddling through, and that's good. But that should not blind us to the fact that we have long-standing systemic inequalities that are impacting racialized communities and indigenous peoples are far more than the mainstream for some of the reasons that I've already mentioned. And that one of the things that we should do is continue to protest marginalizations. But to come back to the writing, I was just thinking the other day that when I was thinking about how to describe ourselves, I'm talking about everybody right now, all of us. We are all untouchables. Like the untouchable caste in India.
Yeah.
Even though the caste system was supposedly overthrown decades ago, I think remnants of it still persist. But we have all become untouchables in a sense. With this idea that we can't touch, we can't hug. We've got to maintain the social distancing and so on. And God forbid that you smile at anybody who's not an immediate member of your family, because then you could be communicating, the aerosolization of your potential germs across the ether to some unsuspecting person who doesn't want your smile, for crying out loud. That could just be dangerous. Yeah. So I think it would be a real challenge to write a novel about these times, but also it would be a great way to analyze what's going on. One of the things that's also been exposed by this virus is how we do not care about the elderly, how we find the elderly to be disposable. And I say that as somebody who is 60 and hopes to be 70 and hopes to be 80. So I'm not far behind seniors. And as far as Shoppers Drug Mart is concerned, I've been a senior since I was 55 years old. I should take advantage of that. Go for my 20% discount on Thursdays. I haven't been smart enough to do that. But anyway, as a senior myself, I got to say that it's been appalling to see how nasty we have been as a society and as a relatively rich society towards people who require long-term care in the later years of what have probably been very productive lives in terms of love for others, productivity for the economy, patriotism and service to the country. And yet we have been prepared to simply warehouse folks and deny their caregivers an adequate income to make them want to continue to do that work beyond whatever charity they have in their hearts. And I think once again, it's been exposed how we're willing to let people die. And the worst part is we've always been willing to let people die. Think about the opioid crisis, right? And the slowness of governments to respond to that. It's like, oh, somebody's doing drugs, they're taking opioids and they died, they had an overdose. Oh, that's no problem. That's okay. So there are lots of people that we consider to be disposable. Homeless, again, those who are suffering from substance abuse situations, the racialized and marginalized on reserves. Think of the suicide crisis on reserves, which makes it into the headlines when there's been a spate of suicides. Then the government sends in social workers and counselors, and they're there for who knows how long, then they are removed. And then a few years later or a few months later, there's another spate of suicides, which tells us that the underlying conditions have not been addressed, which is again another long way of saying that any novel that would be written about this crisis is very likely to be a dystopic novel that would actually be anchored in analyzing the inequities, inequalities that we have right now. And the fact that we have always been willing to throw people away as a society. We always have been.
Yeah.
And this pandemic has just made it clearer about who we are willing to dispense with,
Yeah.
who are willing to throw out. You're old, you're sick, we don't need you anymore. Goodbye, farewell. And no, nobody can hug you, nobody can kiss you, nobody can give you a decent funeral, right? Because of the pandemic. And it just shows how cold-blooded we have become, as opposed to all of the nice rhetoric about community and standing together. No, we've never stood together, except for military campaigns on one sort or another. But generally, society is a seething competition amongst groups to each get their own and hold on to their own, and too bad for everybody else. And what we have decided to call democracy and law and liberty is simply the ability to let all these violences take place, economic and social violences take place, without anybody getting too concerned about it.
Yeah. So can we expect any novel about this dystopic society that came from COVID-19?
Oh, I think we will. I think that all of us who are writers, we're all probably taking notes, and we're all writing this, that, and the other thing.
Yeah.
And at one point, things will start to come into our heads, and we'll begin to write a story, a novel. I've already written a poem. I've written 2 poems so far, and one of them was aired on the National on May 11th. For anybody who wants to look it up, May 11, 2020, I have a poem on the National, CBC National.
Yeah.
So you can find it on YouTube or whatever, that broadcast that day. And the poem is called Weathering. It's a positive poem about how we will survive, we'll come through, and we'll have light once again beyond the clouds. I was actually thinking about Sam Cooke. Change is going to have to come.
Yep.
I don't know what's up there beyond the clouds.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That line and that song, and of course Bill Withers, Lean on Me. I mean, these are some of the other songs that come to my mind right now. Just as inspiriting works to keep our spirits up and remain optimistic. And I think we have to be optimistic. So yeah, there will be art. Art will come out of this. Writing will come out of this. Music will come out of this. Sculpting will come out of this. Movies will come out of this. And documentary films will come out of this. Everything is going to come out of this.
Yes.
For those of us who are fortunate enough to survive and maintain health, to be able to reflect on it, comment on it, and use it as the great teachable moment that it is. The great teachable moment that it is across practically every single discipline that we can think of. Every single discipline we can think of: ecology, economics, theology, culture. I mean, one of the things that amazed me in the first weeks of this pandemic is how easy it was to shut down the theaters, shut down the cinema, shut down the concert halls, all the places where the performance arts could be presented. Just closed down, shut down. What was the message? The message was the arts don't matter. The arts don't matter. The arts don't matter as much as healthcare. I agree. The arts maybe don't matter as much as the treatment we receive from doctors and nurses. I'm going to go along with that for about this long, because what we also know is that culture is essential for our spirit, our mental health. Exactly. It's amazing to me that right now governments are saying, "Oh, we're going to relax this and relax that." Why? Because people need to be able to get out, and get some sunshine, get some fresh air, and so on.
Yeah.
Well, trying to be safe at the same time, but it's not good for people to be all cooped up if they don't have to be because of compromised immune systems and so on. I also thought it was crazy that the bookstores got closed. Just like that, bookstores closed. Boom.
Yeah.
Why couldn't there be social distancing in bookstores? Why did bookstores have to close? They're non-essential. Really? Non-essential? I'm biased. I'm a writer, so I'm biased. I want people to go into bookstores.
Yeah.
But beyond that, it's what the book represents. It's what literature represents, which is the power of thought. And eventually, whoever comes up with a vaccine, whoever it is, whatever group of people it is who develop a vaccine, they're going to be thoughtful people probably, and whose minds have been trained, at least in part, by reading a little bit of literature here and there. And so I thought that was very striking too, that governments could very easily say a golf course can open, but a bookstore can't. Basically putting, they've got a scale of values that says golfing is more important than reading. And if I were a golfer, maybe I should become a golfer and I wouldn't complain. I'd have to be happy that the golf courses have been allowed to flourish once again. But I like the fact, keeping in mind that Italy got hit very hard by COVID, very, very hard. I believe they kept their bookstores open. I believe they did. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But or they were slower to close their bookstores than we certainly were. And I'm pretty sure that if they were closed, they're open now. And we were able to keep the grocery stores open, liquor stores open, the beer stores open, bookstores, no, closed. And so that just says a lot. It says a lot, something to think about. That governments could just cancel culture, boom, just like that. And not be very quick about getting those venues reopened, even with social distancing and so on. It says a lot and gives us plenty to think about.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, I just want to know: do you have any other final thoughts when it comes to COVID-19? When it comes to how it affects your literature, how it affects what we deem as essential, and how it affects us as humans?
Well, one of the words that has been bandied about a lot in this crisis is unprecedented. Everything is unprecedented. These are unprecedented times, we are told. Yeah. Unprecedented economic turmoil, unprecedented health crises. And I need to say, folks, where's your history? None of this is unprecedented. The exact experience that we are going through is different, but not unprecedented. We've had major health scares before, which have impacted society greatly. I need to remind everybody, since I'm 60, I can go back in time. I can remind everybody that it wasn't until the 1950s that polio was, they found a vaccine for polio. Right up until the early 1960s, a lot of people still had large families. Why? Because babies died. A high infant mortality rate, very high infant mortality rate. It was only with medicines and neonatal care that came into existence essentially since the 1960s that have allowed childbirth to occur with much less loss of life for the most part. So what I'm trying to get at here is that we have been in certain ways living in a bit of a fool's paradise in terms of thinking that we had all of these viruses and all of these diseases licked, and that we would never be impacted again by significant health crises. And it's one more testament to His Excellency, Barack Obama, that during his time as US president, he actually put together a task force to plan for the next pandemic. That was in 2014. Oh, wow. One of the first things that, sorry?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, wow. He brought together a team of scientists and made the announcement back in 2014 to start preparing for what he knew was going to happen, that there would be another pandemic, That was partly because of Ebola, because he managed the Ebola crisis, right?
Okay.
And again, we're talking about unprecedented. What about Ebola? Okay, it was in Africa mainly, but hey, wasn't that a major health crisis that shut down society and shut down the economy and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But I guess it doesn't count because it was in Africa. But hey, that's a precedent. That's a precedent. But it was because of the Ebola crisis that Obama and others managed with a lot of assistance to African nations, the African states, to deal with it, and also helped to ensure that it would not spread any further, that dreadful disease, that he decided to put together this think tank of scientists to prepare to plan for the next pandemic. One of the first things that Mr. Dump,
Mr. Trump,
Donald Dump, one of the first things he did as president was cancel that workforce, cancel that think tank planning for the next pandemic. So the other problem I have with that word unprecedented is that it can be used by governments to say, oh, because this situation is unprecedented, when it really isn't, but because it's unprecedented, you need to give us a lot more power than we usually get to exercise in order to deal with it. We need unprecedented powers to deal with an unprecedented crisis. I want to attack that whole idea that this is unprecedented. What's unprecedented maybe is the fact that we didn't plan for it. Again, going back to biblical times, 7 years of fat and 7 years of famine. Any civilized nation, any civilization should realize that we are not immune to nature. We are not immune to nature. And that we should never think that we cannot have famine, that we cannot have plagues, that we cannot have health emergencies. There will always be with us so long as we remain mortal, which looks like it's going to be forever. So for as long as we are mortal beings, we had better be prepared for famine, for sickness, for disease. We should always be prepared. Always have something set aside to deal with these emergencies, because they're always going to come. They're always going to happen. When we emerge from COVID-19 this year, next year, the year after, whenever it is, we better get ready for the next one. Because next one is going to know these bugs are smart. Next one's going to know, well, they use this against the COVID-19, so we're going to do a COVID-27 that they're not going to be able to deal with. And that's going to really mess them up.
Yeah.
So we've got to use our God-given intelligence to again come back to essentially socialistic modes of thinking, modes of thought. That if we want to maintain community and maintain society, we've got to plan for scarcity. We've got to plan for famine. We've got to plan for future problems that we hope will never happen, but that we need to be prepared for. And we also need to pay more attention to the environment greatly. What more can I say? I probably said too much already.
No. You said, honestly, you've opened my mind so much. I wasn't even thinking much about book places being closed, like Chapters, the arts, like you said, movie theaters, museums, all these things have been closed, and we really don't pay attention to these things. We just think about other things like the grocery store, the gym, all these things that we're so accustomed to. But it's really the important things like the arts, like you mentioned, that are actually really important, and we don't really pay attention to that. But that also shows where our interests lie, as we it shows where our interest lies, to be honest. It does.
Our interest lies in a refrigerator.
Exactly.
Fridge. That's our interest.
Yeah.
What's in the fridge? What's in the cupboard?
Yeah.
And of course, Lysol wipes.
Yeah.
Lysol wipes and bathroom tissue.
Exactly. That's all. But you've touched on a lot, and I really appreciate for even giving us the opportunity to interview you. As I said before, I know COVID-19 must have impacted your life greatly, so I know you must be busy. You have other things to take care of, so I really appreciate this. That's basically it for the interview. Thank you so much, sir.
Stefon, thank you so much, and I wish you the best of luck with this revealing magazine.
Thank you.
Reveal everything. I gotta give you one quotation from May 1968. From it was graffiti on a Paris wall in May '68, and they almost had a revolution in France in May 1968. But one of my favorite expressions from that moment of ferment and turmoil in France was this sentence in English: "Make shame more shameful by making it public." Make shame more shameful by making it public. So I've always thought that to reveal things is exactly what you got to do.
Making it public knowledge, exactly. That's so true. That's so true. That's so true. Well, sir, I hope you all the best. Stay safe during these unprecedented times.
Thank you so much.
No problem, sir. Take care.
Very, very best wishes.
Best wishes, sir.
Okay, thanks.